Well, one thing that missionaries have to work on as they're preparing to head out into a foreign mission field, especially one that's new to them, is this practice and process of what's called contextualization. Contextualization is, in essence, it's basically taking the gospel and learning how to make it understandable and relevant to a particular culture. Like sometimes language it has to be adapted and adjusted to. And you can imagine, depending on the context that someone is going into, that can be to a greater or lesser degree a very complicated process. And it's also a process that I am convinced more and more is needed in our own culture. To say that our culture is changing at a rapid pace just doesn't seem, it feels like we can't keep up with how we might minister in our culture. And long gone, if they ever existed, long gone are the days where you can just hand, you remember the little yellow tracts that you could hand to somebody, 4 spiritual laws? Those one-size-fits-all approaches, those are long gone. And so we really have to be thoughtful and prayerful about what it looks like to minister and take the gospel into our culture. Thankfully, that's not a new thing. We have plenty of examples, not only from church history, but from Scripture. Paul was a master at contextualization. And if you think about his life, I mean, he was a Jew who was raised as a Roman citizen with quite a bit of Greek influence in his life. And so he was able to move in and out of those cultures with relative ease, while at the same time remaining faithful to the gospel. And one of the prime examples of that is the story we're going to look at in Acts 17. Last week we saw how he and Silas had headed out on the second missionary journey and picked up Timothy as this new ministry partner early on. And the rest of chapter 16, they are basically they spend all their time in Philippi. And you can read the famous story of Paul and Silas praising God at midnight and the miraculous escape from prison, and the conversion of Lydia and the wonderful ministry that they had there. When we get into chapter 17, they are in Macedonia. And they are there in response to a vision that Paul had back in chapter 16 before they got to Philippi. And they begin in the city of Thessalonica, which is the capital city of Macedonia. It was a very significant city, even beyond the fact that it was the capital. It was wealthy. It was a very well-known, important city. Had a very diverse population, about 200,000, and there were quite a few Jews in that city. And from there, they go about 50 miles down the road to Berea, which, in contrast to Thessalonica, was not a significant city. In fact, there was a historian that said that it described it as a city off the beaten path. The Roman road would run through that area, and Berea was 10 miles off the Roman road. So it was one of those, I always joke about Smithfield being a town that you have to want to get to. That was Berea. And I can say that because I married a Smithfieldite. That's Berea. It was still a pretty good-sized city, but just relatively unimportant. Now, Paul's pattern whenever he entered a city was almost always the same. And we see the same process in these two cities. He starts in the synagogue, which is where he would find the people who were seeking after God. They were the worshipers. They were familiar with the Hebrew Scriptures. And so that would be where he would begin. So he not only had a pattern where he went, he had a pattern of what he said. He would begin with the law and the prophets and all of that, and point to Jesus as the fulfillment of all of those scriptures. And there was also a similar pattern to the response that he would get. There would be many people who would believe or would be at least drawn in by this message, quite a few Jews and an increasing number of Gentiles as his ministry goes on. And then there would be those who did not respond to his message in the same way, to varying degrees of hostility. In Thessalonica, that hostility was pretty intense. As this group gets upset and they go out looking for Paul and Silas and Timothy, fortunately for them, unfortunately for somebody else, they couldn't find them. And so they arrest this man by the name of Jason, who was not one of the Argonauts, but he was one of these that had been converted under Paul's ministry, whose home the church met in. In fact, if you read the letter to the first letter to the Thessalonians, That's who that letter is addressed to, the congregation meeting in Jason's house. So even beyond their time there, this church continued to grow and thrive to the point where Paul wrote them a letter. But Jason and these others are arrested. They're brought in before the authorities on the charge that these men are turning the world upside down, which you can imagine if you took somebody to the police station and told them these people are turning the world upside down, the police would probably laugh at you, and you might be arrested for bringing somebody in. But in Rome, you got to understand, at the top of the list of things that Rome did not like in their cities was unrest. So any kind of uprise or something like that would get the immediate attention of the authorities, which happens here. Now, thankfully for Jason and the others, they don't seem to suffer any more punishment than what being arrested, because they post bond and they're released. But it just kind of set a tone where the believers think, well, we need to get Paul and Silas, we need to get them out of town. And so they go to Berea. Same process. Paul starts in the synagogue, but the difference this time is the response. And I like how Luke describes the people in Berea. They were of more noble character. These were better people. This was a better breed of people that Paul was addressing. And they receive the message that he has to give eagerly. And they take it one step farther. They actually go to the scriptures themselves to make sure that what Paul is telling them is true. They can put the pieces together, and the Holy Spirit uses that and works through that. And there's quite a few people who come to Christ, including a number of prominent Greeks there, which gets the attention of these people that have already tried to shut this thing down in Thessalonica, which is 50 miles down the road. It's not enough to shut this thing down in their own city. They've got to go to this out-of-the-way village or out-of-the-way town 50 miles away and shut this down. And so they stir up the people, and it seems to work because, again, they rush Paul out of town. Unfortunately, he's rushed out of town without Silas and Timothy. And he sails 300 miles south to the city of Athens. And that's what we're going to focus on, is his time in Athens. And so I want to pick up the story here in Acts 17, beginning at verse 16. And we're going to read this in a few chunks, basically to look at what Paul saw and felt, and then what he said and did, and then the response. So verse 16 reads, "While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace every day, or day by day, with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, 'What is this babbler trying to say?' Others remarked, 'He seems to be advocating foreign gods.' They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, 'May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean.' All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. And so Paul travels to this great city of Athens. By this time, though, it's about AD 50, AD 60, and Athens is not anywhere near what it used to be. It's kind of a shell of its former glory. 400 years before, it was the center of the world. Politically, philosophically, intellectually, it had a huge population. It boasted names like Aristotle and Socrates and Plato. But by this time, it had been conquered by Rome. A significant part of the population had left. In fact, there were probably only about 10 to 20,000 people left in Athens. But because of its historical significance, it still held a place in the world. And Luke describes it as a city that was littered with temples and idols and statues. In fact, the term that he uses there is drowning in idols. In fact, it's estimated that there were probably at that time 30,000 statues dedicated to Greek gods. And one ancient historian said, "It is easier to find a statue in Athens than it is a person." This is the environment that Paul walks into. Now, we don't know what his plans were. He might have just been planning to lay low until Silas and Timothy show up and he can get on down the road. But we know that that's not what ends up happening, because as he walks around the city and he takes all of this in, it really just starts to bother him. It starts to affect him physically. He is so upset that these people who have been so known for their pursuit of knowledge and truth are so captured by these lies. And the term that Luke uses there, it's almost like he has a seizure. It upsets him so much. He can't do nothing. He has to speak. And so, again, he begins in the synagogue. But that's not where he stops, because we see him do something a little bit different. He goes to a place called the Agora. Now, Greek and Roman cities were typically built around a city center. The Agora would have been that. It was the center of commerce and trade and debate and all intellectual things. And that's where Paul goes to debate with these philosophers. Now, think about how different a context this is for Paul. When he goes into the synagogue, he's already got a base to start from. They're familiar with the Hebrew Scriptures. They know Yahweh. They know Jehovah. They know that there was a Messiah coming, so he's at least got something to work with. It's very similar to when you walk in the doors here. You're expecting to sing some worship songs. You're expecting to hear a sermon, hopefully out of the Bible. It's not so much the case out there. People out there might not necessarily care what God has to say or what you have to say about what God has to say. It's a different mindset. It's a different environment, different context. And Luke tells us that there are two specific groups that Paul is engaging in debate, the Epicureans and the Stoics. Epicureans were largely atheists. If they did believe in God, they were at the best deists. They believed that if gods did exist, they were disconnected, they weren't involved in human life. And they also believed that the primary goal in life was pleasure. But they weren't hedonists. They were actually very measured in their morality. They believed that if you lived a life of hedonism, that was a good way to ruin your life. And so if you really wanted to experience pleasure, you had to be measured and in control. And along with their atheistic tendencies, they believed that if the human had a soul, it died when the body died, and so there was nothing beyond here. Stoics, on the other hand, were more pantheists. They believed that God was kind of in everything, and their goal was to become one with that great force that was in the universe. They were all about self-control. If they experienced something tragic or something kind of a big triumph, they had to keep their emotions in check. That's where that term comes from, Stoic. Their belief about the soul was that when a person died, the soul just separated from the body and got absorbed into the great black hole of the universe. That gives you a little bit of a context of the two main groups that Paul is reaching here and speaking to. And he gets, again, a mixed reaction. There are some that are accusing him of being a babbler. The Greek term that's used there is seed picker. And it is a picture of a bird that just randomly walks around and just finds things to eat, whatever it can find. They're accusing Paul of just taking an idea from here and here and here and bringing all of these things together to sound smart. He's a seed picker. He doesn't have a coherent philosophy. It doesn't make any sense to them. Others are saying that he's advocating for foreign gods because he's talking about Jesus and the resurrection. And so they decide, you know what, we're going to bring you to this council, this group called the Areopagus, which was actually a place and a group of people that had a varying degree of influence and authority over the years. And their job really was to listen to all of these ideas and philosophies and determine whether or not it was a well thought out, intelligent, coherent philosophy, or if it was nonsense. If it was the former, they were encouraged to continue discussing and talking about those things. If they determined it was nonsense, well, they really didn't have the authority to remove you from Athens, but you would basically get laughed out of the city. They wouldn't listen to what you had to say anymore. That's the group that Paul is addressing. And this is what they do day in and day out. And the sense that you get from Luke is they don't do this so that they can nail down the truth. They're doing this almost as a form of entertainment. They did nothing but just sit around and talk about these things all day long. And that's who Paul is addressing. And this is what he says as he's brought before them in verse 22. It says, Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. So at this point, Paul could have done what he normally does. He could have gone to the Old Testament. He could have gone to all the promises and prophecies and kind of pointed out how Jesus was the fulfillment of all those things. But it probably would not have made a whole lot of sense to these people he's talking to. It would not have resonated with them. If they knew the law and the prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures, they didn't know them or appreciate them in the way that the people in the synagogue did. They might have known them intellectually, and that was it. They didn't revere those Scriptures. And so Paul does something that is genius. He draws on his own Roman and Greek background, and he goes a completely different direction. He knows that he needs to contextualize this message for the people he's addressing so that they'll understand it. He's wandered around the city. Paul, being the intellectual that he was, he knew Athens. If he'd never been there before, he knew. And he's got a sense of who these people are. And so he begins. He says, it's fairly obvious as I walk around the city that you all are very religious. The 30,000 statues and idols kind of gave that away. So you're religious. It's obvious you're seeking after something. You're seeking for the truth. But I did happen to notice you have a very interesting altar. One that's addressed or set aside for to an unknown God. Now, archaeology would tell us that was probably pretty accurate. And the thought behind it was Greek history, and if you know anything about Greek mythology, you couldn't even count the number of gods that exist. And you had to live your life making sure you didn't anger the gods, because if you did, one of them would clobber you. But what if in all your work and in all of your seeking of these gods, you happen to miss one? And so they just wanted to make sure their bases were covered. If we have an altar to an unknown God, hopefully this one will not get upset with us. They didn't know they were about to meet the God that they didn't know that they were looking for. And so that's what Paul does. He uses that as the setup. And strategically, from his point of view, it's genius. And it's an incredible opportunity because no matter what he says about this God, they have publicly acknowledged they don't know anything about him. And so if they have any intellectual honesty, they can't just dismiss what he says right off the bat. They have to engage it. They have to think about it. And so this is a great open door for him. What are they going to say? That they can't say, well, we know that. No, they can't. They've already said, we don't know who this God is. And he goes to work. He starts with the idea, all the way back to the beginning, that this unknown God is the creator of everything. And even in that world, they would have understood that the universe did not self-create. There had to be a force or some kind of entity behind it. And Paul identifies who this is. He is the Lord of heaven and earth. And he starts chipping away at all of this philosophy and these gods that they have. And he says, and if he's the Lord of heaven and earth, and everything exists and comes from his hand, you shouldn't think that you can give him anything. He doesn't need anything. He doesn't need anything from us. And he's not really going to be impressed with all of these statues and fancy things that you have built. And with those statements, he really just undercuts the whole basis for this. That it doesn't matter how hard you try. Number one, you're not going to please these gods who don't exist anyway. And that's not what God's looking for. That's not what this God is looking for. And he goes on to say that God has made everyone from one human ancestor, which cuts away at another famous popular Greek thought, and that was because they're Greeks, they were better than everyone else. And Paul says, no, not so much. We all came from the same person. We all have one common ancestor. He doesn't name him, but we know he's referring to Adam. And God not only did that, he actually orchestrated and set up the places and times that all of these people would be gathered together for the purpose that somewhere along the line they would start looking for him and find him. And I love the little statement that he makes. It's almost a word of encouragement to them. Though he is not far from any of us. He's not that hard to find. He's not hiding. And so he's almost letting them know, you've been searching for something. You've been groping in the dark for this. You've been ignorantly searching for what you don't know, but he's not that hard to find. In fact, he wants to be known. And then he quotes two of their poets. Both of those quotes come from Greek philosophy and poetry. This one, for in him we live and move and have our being. That sounds like something that an Old Testament prophet could have written. And then he says, and we are his offspring. So Paul was familiar with their thought. He was familiar with some of their writings. And he basically says, even some of your own philosophers have been on the right track here. They've been heading sort of in the right direction. They just haven't had the whole story. Contrary to what you Epicureans believe, God is not distant, removed. He's intimately involved. We live and move and have our being in him. And we are his offspring. And if we're his offspring, it seems silly to think that he would look like one of these things that you have built out of stone. And so Paul just basically demolishes all of their arguments and all of their whole system of belief. And then he says this. This is kind of the whole point of Paul's sermon. God, up to this point, has been willing to overlook your ignorance. You've been looking for what you don't understand, and you have not had the whole story. But now he's given you the moral of the story. He's given you the conclusion. He's given you the person that this is all about. And he's calling everybody everywhere to repent and acknowledge that this God that you look for, who you claim is unknown, he's revealed himself in a person. And he's going to judge, not by one of these inanimate objects. He's going to judge the world justly by this person. And if you want to know where his credibility comes from, he was crucified, buried, and raised from the dead. That's your evidence. And with that, that's the end of Paul's argument. And this is the response that he gets in verse 32. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered. But others said, we want to hear again on this subject. At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. So this encounter that Paul has is probably 20 to 30 years after the resurrection. We don't know how much the people in Athens knew about what had happened in Jerusalem, but it's probable by this time that some word of this religious leader 30 years ago had had an uprising, this Jewish leader, and he was crucified, and now some of his followers are claiming he's alive. So they might be semi-familiar with what Paul is talking about, but I would imagine most of them had just dismissed it as legend, as a fairy tale. Now Paul is telling them, no, this is actually what happened. And we can see, again, that mixed reaction. There are some who sneer, who think he's just talking ridiculously, but there are others who are intrigued, and they say, we want to hear more. And Paul just basically says by his action, that's all I got for today. And he walks out of the council, almost challenging them to say, if you're really interested in this, you're going to come with me. And notably, one of the members of the Areopagus follows him out, along with a woman named Damaris, which is remarkable when you consider, again, the context here. They aren't necessarily wanting to hear this because they're trying to pin down the truth. They just think it's interesting. They're strange ideas. We want to be entertained by this man from this Jewish Roman citizen who apparently speaks Greek. And that's because what they did, they just heard philosophy after philosophy after. It was what they were doing was nothing new. The message was just very unique. And so there are some who are convinced and they become followers of Jesus. And again, Paul could have done his whole Old Testament spiel and just did the exact same thing, but it probably would not have resonated with this group. And so we see right there this textbook example of what it looks like to contextualize the gospel in a particular situation. So the question is, how do we do that? How do we contextualize the gospel in a culture like ours? A culture that in which the context can vary from person to person, and increasingly so. As we develop our own realities and things like that, the context that you might step into is, we just never know. We will still encounter very highly religious people, which ironically are some of the hardest to reach, because they've already got everything figured out. They don't need the gospel. They don't need all of this. We might encounter people who do have religious experience, but they've been terrible. They have been deeply wounded by their religion. That's a very different context. That's a very different approach. Increasingly, you will find people who have no religious foundation whatsoever. We call them nuns. That's a term that missiologists use, and it's not N-U-N-S, it's N-O-N-E-S. What kind of background do they have? None. And that's becoming an increasing percentage of the population. Now, seen from one perspective, that when you think about contextualizing the gospel, you just think, oh my goodness, I don't even know where to begin. It seems impossible. Seen from a different perspective, man, that opens up all sorts of possibilities. We just have to be prayerful and listen to the Spirit as He leads us into those situations. Unfortunately, my wife was talking about looking for three. You do these three things and you can figure out how to keep kids in church past. If you're looking for these three steps to contextualization today, I can't give it to you. We could have a group and dive into that as a study of what that looks like, but it's beyond the scope of a sermon, I can tell you that. Besides, there's something else that's even more fundamental. There's a more important thing that we have to address and think about before we even get to the question of contextualization. And that's this. People need to see the reality of the gospel that we are so intent on contextualizing. They need to see the evidence of the reality of that in our lives. They need to see that there's something different about us. As long as we are as angry as everybody else, I'll tell you what, this last week has been a week of anger. As long as we are as divisive and looking for things to argue about as anybody else, as long as we behave like everybody else, there's nothing different about us. We're just one of those other arguments that they will gather around to hear interesting things. There's no light, there's just more voices yelling in the darkness. And I really believe these last few years in our world, especially in our country, it's got people shook. Whether they're willing to admit it or not or verbalize this, they know that there is something terribly broken in our world. It's always, as Dr. Metcalf said, it's always been dark. It just seems like we're just more aware of the darkness now. People are anxious. They feel like everything's falling apart. They're looking for somewhere to turn. They're looking for someone that doesn't look like everybody else. They're looking for people that seem to be at peace, that seem to give off this sense that no matter what happens or what's going on, that they have this everything's going to be okay. Because they know the end of the story. They're looking for people that are characterized by kindness and compassion and their willingness to roll up their sleeves and actually back up what they claim they believe. Most of us can't argue at the level of Paul. which is not anything to be ashamed of. He was a genius. There's a reason he wrote 3/4 of the New Testament. We don't have to be like that. But what we can become are living embodiments of the gospel. It doesn't really matter how cute or creative we get in trying to contextualize it if the people we are contextualizing for can't see it in our lives. Talk is cheap. There's some of you, Nathan Covington, evangelist for years in the Church of the Nazarene, said, the things that we truly believe we practice, everything else is just talk. We are the context. People need to see it in us. They need to see a people that resonate with the joy, the love, the joy, the peace, the patience, the kindness, the goodness, the gentleness, the faithfulness, and self-control. We should have the kids do that song. They'll love it. That the gospel brings. And when they ask where all of this comes from, that's when we get our context. That was the whole heartbeat of those 5 weeks when we were talking about bless. That as the hope was that as we pray and listen and eat and serve and share, that people would see the substance of the gospel in our lives, and then they would respond. It's not a program or something that we just think about 1 month out of the year. It's a lifestyle in which we prayerfully and intentionally seek opportunities to meet needs and bless people around us. It's about finding creative ways that we can make a difference and creative ways to bring the gospel into people's lives. But if our lives don't, if people can't see that in us, if our lives don't visibly reflect what we claim to believe, we short circuit before it even gets started. We short circuit any possible context in which people might be open to listen. Can God overcome those things? Oh yeah, you bet. But I'd really, we've talked about being a because of people. I'd rather make his job easier. I'd rather be fertile soil for that to take place in. Is there a need to contextualize? Absolutely. But we better be sure that the gospel we are contextualizing has found a home and a context in our lives. Amen? Would you pray with me?